Hello, everyone. Welcome to the virtual book club for Emily Ladau's brand new book, Demystifying Disability: What to Know, What to Say, and How to Be an Ally, hosted by Easter Seals and a Disability Readathon. My name is Erin Hawley, and I'm the co-creator of the Disability Readathon and a staff member at Easter Seals National. We are so excited for this panel featuring 4 amazing women who are leading activists for disability inclusion and representation. To share more about the event and the Disability Readathon, I'd like to turn this over to Anna.
Hi, everybody. I'm Anna Goldberg. I'm the other co-creator of the Disability Readathon. Our Readathon's mission, Erin and I started, is to uplift disabled authors and creators to bring about societal change and inclusion. And Emily Ladau's new book, Demystifying Disability, an unflinching, comprehensive guide to navigating disability and becoming a better ally, does just that. These topics can be difficult to discuss, but they are so deeply necessary. And Emily, along with Tatiana, Judy, and Andrea, our other panelists, tackle the issues with incredible poise, grace, and wisdom. And speaking of poise, grace, and wisdom, it is my honor to turn things over to a moderator for this evening's discussion, the one and only Judy Heumann. Judy is a lifelong champion for disability civil rights and an internationally recognized icon. You may have seen her last year in the Netflix film Crip Camp, or maybe you joined Easter Seals during our book club for her own memoir, Being Human. Judy, thank you so much for being here tonight, and take it away. I believe we cannot hear you. You are on mute.
Sorry. Before we start our event this evening, I would like to mention that one of our very strong disability rights leaders, Marilyn Goldin, passed away last night, Tuesday. And for those of you who knew her and for those of you who didn't know her, Marilyn was one of the key people behind the work for the Americans with Disabilities Act, both acting as an amazing community organizer around the United States, as well as being an expert in many areas, including in the area of transportation. So for those of you who knew her, you know the contribution she's made. And for those of you who didn't have the privilege to know her, you should Google her and learn more about her great work, because many of the advancements that have been made in many areas, but particularly in the area of transportation, Marilyn had an amazing finger and brain. So thank you all for joining tonight. And I'd really like to thank Anna and Erin for this introduction and for asking me to moderate with these 3 great women. And I will do my very best. And the reality is each one of the women that are going to be speaking tonight can on their own hold a discussion for hours about the work that they're doing. And so what we're going to be doing tonight is melding a discussion, getting people to talk amongst themselves, and then we're going to open it up to you, the audience. So please start thinking now about questions that you may have that you want to pose to us. And after we speak for 30 to 40 minutes, we're going to open it up for Q&A. If for some reason we don't get an avalanche of questions, we will continue to talk. But I'm sure, given the number of people watching tonight, that whether you have a disability or not, you will have a question that is worth our discussing. So I think, as many of us know, this is not a disability issue. The last year and a half has been quite challenging. Our lives have been thrown up in the air and in different ways for each one of us, but it is definitely a unifying characteristic that wherever you're living in the United States or around the world, COVID has altered our lives. And that, as disabled people, is something that we're also very used to. But this, I have to say, has given us additional challenges. We are, as many of you know, the largest minority in the world. And what does that mean? That means that we are at least 15%. It means that there is a campaign that actually started when the Paralympics started, being called We the 15. And if you haven't seen the We the 15 commercial, I encourage you to Google it. But the most important thing I believe about the We the 15 is that it really is the first time that there has been an international commercial and entity that's been set up to try to help educate disabled and non-disabled people about who we are and about the forms of discrimination, who we are, our capacity to be able to be included members in our community. And the venue when this came out was sports. But it leads very nicely into Emily's book. Emily's book, Demystifying Disability, really, in my view, is a primer. It's a book that everyone can benefit from. It's written in Emily's beautiful voice. Emily, to me, is one who can enter any room and be able to engage in discussions with anyone. And I think the purpose of this book to really enable disabled and non-disabled people, and obviously the book was significantly written for non-disabled people, but I think as Emily speaks throughout her book, she also talks about herself as a disabled person and how she and all of us, I think on tonight's panel will agree, we are all learning about the diversity of disability. And we all have experienced ableism towards us, and in many ways where we have maybe also been perpetrators of ableism and racism and other isms towards other people. So let me please introduce our panel tonight. First, you've already been introduced to Emily, but Emily is a dear friend. I learn from her all the time. She's done such interesting work in blogging and her platform dedicated to amplifying authentic narratives of the intersectionality of the disability experience. And she also hosts and co-hosts the Accessibility Stall, a podcast about disability issues. Tatiana Lee, who I've had the privilege of meeting on a number of occasions, is an award-winning actress, international model, and Hollywood entertainment consultant. She has been featured in Forbes and the Washington Post and is a regular contributor to Easter Sales Disability Film Challenge. She's modeled in campaigns for Apple, Target, Zappos, and more. Tatiana is also the 2018 recipient of the Christopher Reeves Acting Scholarship for her contribution to further disability inclusion in media. Andrea Delzell, unfortunately, I've never met before. Unfortunately, I'm meeting you tonight. I've read about you and I've read your blogs and Instagrams. And I think one of the reasons why I was so excited that you were going to be on this program is she is known as the seated nurse. And she's a phenomenal and passionate registered nurse, highly active in healthcare and healthcare advocate, disability rights influencer, and most importantly, a strong survivor. As the first registered nurse to be a wheelchair rider in New York State, I was the first wheelchair rider to be a teacher in New York City. So when I read that, I was like, it's too bad that decades later, we're still dealing with firsts. We should no longer be firsts. But nonetheless, I think we have to appreciate those people who are really breaking down barriers and moving forward and becoming firsts and seconds and thirds, etc. So what I'd like to do now is we're going to get into asking each one of you a question, and we'll do 3 rounds of questions, and then we'll open it up for discussion. through the chat. And may I also say that if it's agreeable to you, it is fine for me that if you want to jump in and add something to something that somebody has already said, that's fine. I think it'll enable our discussion to be more robust. So Emily, as the reason for our coming together tonight, as the editor-in-chief of Rooted in Rights blog, and you might want to also explain what that is, co-host of the Accessibility Stall podcast, and a passionate vocal disability rights activist, your voice has been a key part of the fight for disability inclusion for over a decade. How did you know it was time to write this book? How did it come about?
That's a great question to start off with. And I'm also just so excited to be in such amazing company tonight. And I want to start by clarifying that I feel very much like I'm just a stone in the ocean of disability rights advocacy. And so my priority really is to have a ripple effect where I can change one mind at a time and connect with one person at a time and hope that that will continue to grow, and to also be in collaboration with so many amazing people who are also doing such important work. So regarding this book, I have always been a very passionate storyteller when it comes to disability. And I have always believed in the power of creating connections and meeting people where they are to educate about disability. And as you mentioned, I do a lot of that through Rooted in Rights, not through telling my own story, but through supporting disabled writers with all different types of disabilities, often with multiple other marginalized identities, to share their stories of what their disability experience is like. And through that, my passion for educating and telling these stories continued to grow. And in 2019, I was actually on a podcast talking with another disabled friend just about the experience of being disabled. And a literary agent heard me speaking and said, "Hey, have you ever thought about writing a book?" And so initially, I thought that I would be writing a book to tell my own story, the story of myself and my mom, who shares the same disability that I do. And if you want to hear more about that, I can plug Judy's podcast, The Human Perspective, because my mom and I were just on that podcast recently. But my agent came back to me and said, there's a gap in the market right now around actually explaining the basics of disability. And so she said, why not give that a try? And give it a try. I definitely did. I acknowledge fully that I'm one person. This is one book, and that I'm not going to be able to cover everyone's experience. I can't even fully cover my own experience. 30 years in a disabled body is not something that you can put into one book. And so for me, it was really about creating a starting point, creating a conversation entryway for people who may not be sure how to talk about disability, and who are often very well-meaning, but maybe just don't know the right words to say, maybe don't know how to interact properly. People who are so busy overthinking disability that they're not realizing that we're human beings like anybody else. And so that's my dream for this book, is really just to be a conversation starter. And that's what motivated me the whole time I was writing. You're muted again. Technology.
All right, thank you. I'm going to ask Emily a question that I'm going to ask each one of you to respond to also. Why do you believe storytelling is important?
I love that question. And I think that in order to see change, we need to see ourselves reflected back at us. And when we tell our stories, we can be in solidarity with other people who are searching to see their stories being told. And so there's change within the community, and then there's change beyond the community, because when we're the ones in charge of telling our own stories, shaping our own narratives, and representing ourselves, then we have more control over how people perceive disability. And so storytelling creates community, creates connections, creates understanding. And if we're not sharing our stories openly, and I should clarify, I don't think anyone should be a teachable moment, right? You don't just exist to be a teachable moment. That's not anyone's job. But if we're not sharing our stories openly and meeting people where they're at, I think we're missing a lot of opportunities for connection and for deeper understanding of disability and ultimately making the world a more inclusive and accessible place.
So Tatiana, do you think that storytelling is important? And do you find that storytelling is a meaningful part of your work as you try to break down the walls in Hollywood?
First of all, thank you so much for having me. I echo Emily's sentiments where I'm in great company, women I admire, and I love the work that you all do. And I couldn't be thrilled to be anywhere else than here with the four of you right now. So thank you so much for having me here. Storytelling is important, and it's a huge part of the work that I do because I work in entertainment and it's all about storytelling, from the photo shoots I'm involved in to the film and TV shows that I'm involved in whatever way, whether in front or behind the camera. It's all storytelling. But I think in storytelling, it strips everything down and shows people that everyone is just having a human experience. Human, Judy human. And I think storytelling does that. And it's, it finds those common barriers. And just like Emily said, strips it all down and shows that we are just find that commonality and, so many other things. And just how, we're not that far off from each other, and that we can create community around various topics of interest, whether, mine is fashion. I've been able to collaborate with other people who love fashion, who maybe never realized that a person with a disability loves fashion just as much as they do. And, you find those commonality and those human experiences. And I think that is what's needed to exactly, create inclusion, to see us other than just, oh, this person in a wheelchair or this, and see all those other aspects of us that humanizes us, which for some reason society has such a hard time doing.
Thank you. So Andrea, you're clearly a storyteller because of your Instagram, but I guess my question to you is, why do you think telling stories is important? And is there a particular story that you speak about as it pertains to how you were able to get into your profession as a nurse who uses a wheelchair?
Of course. And again, I mimic the sentiments of all the women. Thank you so much for having me here tonight. When we consider storytelling, what is it at its very core is seeing someone for who they are within the moment that they're in. Whether it's just saying your name, whether that's your introduction, whether that's how you present into a room, that's all considered storytelling. And we all own who we are. We identify with who we are. We find it. We navigate the world that way. And if we were meant to navigate the world secularly, very singular, not with anyone else, then fine. Storytelling is not for anyone else. That's how we're meant to move around the world. But that's not who we are. We are human beings, and we're meant to be social butterflies. We are meant to be around other people and kind of find that common ground, like Emily said. And the only way you find that common ground is to speak and to talk and to share the stories of the experiences that we have been through, so that we can push the forward movement. If your story wasn't as so impactful as it was for the 1990s, right, and the movement that came with the ADA, I would be nowhere today. Right. And that is a huge part of the story that might not have been told to get to where I am or who I am right now. But the story that I tell is that I had to go through 76 interviews just to get a clinical position during a pandemic. When you put that into perspective, what you had to do in the 1980s and the 90s, and then forward even till today, impacts how my story is now perceived and how I get to tell my story of my accessibility needs and how my disability is not my death sentence, but in actuality, a motivation to continue and to show that life is worth living.
Yeah, I think that's very important. And so my experience suing the New York Board of Ed was in 1970. And so I think it's really very telling and brings us back also to Emily's book and what we've all been saying. Allyship, I call it also discrimination, and what responsibility do we have to really learn more about ableism is adversely affecting those of us with disabilities, including all the other isms, because I think, we're intersectional, and one ism typically also means that there are other isms that we address. I mean, for me, I think storytelling is so very important because it gives guidance to other people to be able to tell their stories. And I think it legitimizes the pain and joy that we are experiencing. I don't believe that our stories should all be painful stories. But I think, as we've each just said, we all have painful stories. And what I think has been important about the four of us as examples for the hundreds of thousands of other people who are out there is that there is something within us and in many ways within our families that have made us realize that we're not going to allow someone to defeat us. And so our stories allow other people to listen and to learn. And I really encourage people, even if it's just beginning privately, to tell yourself those stories that have been really painful and to look at what you've been able to do to move forward. I hope that's, one outcome that can come from tonight's discussion, if I could speak now. So let's move on to another question. Emily, you wrote this book largely during a global pandemic, as we were discussing, when the conversation around disability was shifting and we all had to re-examine what accessibility and inclusion meant. How did this time in our world inform your work or make you think differently about what you were writing?
Interestingly enough, I'm not sure how much the pandemic changed what I was writing, because the reality is that disabled people have long been dealing with a lot of the issues that the pandemic only served to amplify. And so the ableism that we were all collectively experiencing in light of the pandemic was not suddenly new to us, right? It wasn't like it was a revelation that people thought that disabled lives were not worth living, that doctors would choose to ration healthcare and choose the lives of someone non-disabled over the lives of someone disabled simply because of a value judgment on that person's life because they had a disability. It was not a surprise that nobody wanted to listen to disabled people when we asked for things to be remote, when we asked for the option to telework or have a doctor's visit online or go to school through the computer. But then suddenly when it affected everybody, we were able to shift. None of this was surprising. So I'm not really sure that it did affect how I wrote the book, with the exception of a couple of mentions of COVID. But really what I wanted to do was get to some of these root issues like ableism, like inaccessibility, that were only magnified 100 times, 1,000 times over when the pandemic happened, because I don't think that people before the pandemic were broadly conscious of the ableism that's built into so many of our systems. I mean, ableism is not just something that happens on an individual level, as we all know. Certainly somebody making a rude comment or a judgment is ableism, but ableism is also baked into every system, from transportation to healthcare to voting, you name it. There's probably ableism baked into it. And so I wanted people to understand these basic concepts in the hopes that maybe that would then help them make the broader connection to the fact that, oh, yeah, ableism is a really big problem that's affecting quite honestly, not only disabled people during the pandemic, but pretty much anybody who gets sick with COVID, anybody who's experiencing long COVID, anybody who's experiencing health problems during the pandemic. Ableism is something that people have to deal with. And so my hope is that by breaking down what that actually means and making people aware of the fact that ableism exists alongside racism, exists alongside xenophobia, transphobia, you name it, recognizing the interplay of all of those types of discrimination and oppression and how the pandemic only served to amplify that. That was my goal. I just want people to understand the basics and then take that a step or two further and start applying it to how we've been affected and how the world around us reacts to disabled people all the time. So yeah, I mean, I wish I had some profound answer about how my entire writing process changed because of the pandemic. But the reality is that what happened was I sat in the corner of my living room, didn't go anywhere, and wrote for 9 months inside because that was what I was doing. That was how I was staying safe personally. And I hoped that on the other side of it, I would be able to give people the opportunity to engage around these very real concepts that were just starting to come into our collective consciousness.
Thank you. So Tatiana, your recent Forbes feature said Tatiana Lee's activism is changing the culture in Hollywood. As everyone on this panel knows, it's not easy to make waves in an industry that often feels impossibly exclusive and frankly discouraging. What is your response to the failure of the Emmys to have an accessible stage? And how did that make you feel as a disabled person who clearly, you weren't nominated for an award, so you wouldn't have been having to get on the stage, but what do you see as the symbolism of the continuing Emmys and others not making themselves accessible? And what are some of your recommendations about how to deal with this extreme ableism and discrimination?
Oh my gosh. So I have a lot of thoughts, but first of all, the Emmys, that was just completely unacceptable, especially with all of these, calls for more diversity and inclusion. And, sometimes they become almost kind of like lip service. It's like, we're going to say it because it sounds good, but it's like, we're not going to really do the work. And it's really unacceptable. And yeah, it just is. And there's a lot of conversation. A lot of the work that I do is having these conversations with people. Why is this happening? What is the barrier? And like Emily said, talking about meeting people where they are. And it's like, oh, well, do you not know what accommodations are? And these are the things that you need to do to be accessible. And having those conversations. What do you need to be accessible? But so yeah, the Emmys and the industry in itself just needs to do better. I think we're slowly getting there with having Crip Camp be nominated for so many awards and so many other projects out there that are doing really, really well. We're slowly getting there. But there's still so much more work that needs to be done for people to realize that, yeah, it doesn't matter if someone's nominated or not. It should just be embedded in it. And, having this conversation, this idea about universal design and getting people to think about that, because it does send a message of inclusion. It sends a message of we accept you, we want you here. And it inspires people. If I were to see that as a kid, I probably wouldn't have waited until my late 20s, early 30s to try to, have an acting career. I probably would have accomplished it a lot sooner because it would have gave me that feeling of being welcomed. And what do I say to people? I would just say, and keep speaking up with social media and with disabled people being able to have access to social media to be able to tell our own stories and to voice our own opinions. We've been able to create the change that we've created now. I started my activism with writing on a blog and talking on YouTube and Instagram. And, I didn't have those platforms before. You know, we've all had to take it into our own hands. Emily writing, you know, her own book, and, you know, to tell these stories, no one is going to tell them for us. And so what I say is to keep tweeting about it, keep writing about it, keep holding these people accountable, and let people know what you want to see. And, you know, we have so much further to go. I mean, we're just now getting to acknowledging white disabled people, where, you know, someone like myself, who was a disabled Black woman who was also, you know, plus size. And so thinking about that, and it's like the industry hasn't even got to thinking about someone that looks like me. You know what I mean? We're just starting to wrap our mind around the cisgendered, straight white guy in a wheelchair. And it's like, we have so much more to go. But yeah, those are some of my thoughts with that.
Thank you so much, Tatiana. Okay, Andrea. So you're paving the way in your own industry as a seated nurse, working on the front lines, literally, and during a pandemic. You are one of the few in your position, and you said that you interviewed 76 times before you were able to get a job. What do you wish hospitals, I guess the way I would like to put it is, do you believe that the hospital or hospitals that you're working in have learned something by having you there? And what are some of the things that they have learned? And do you believe that the lessons they're learning are being passed around, at least limitedly in the industry, to allow people to see that they should be looking at the qualifications that people bring to a job, and how having a disability can really be a very important component of the person doing the work as an example for other patients and other healthcare providers?
All of it. So yes, there's so much to unpack with healthcare. And I think that I want to start by saying that healthcare is this driving force for the fact that inclusion is not happening. The language that the medical model uses is so demeaning to those with disabilities, but yet on the brighter side, nurses are the ones that are giving you hope, right? We hold your hand through your most vulnerable times of your life. We make sure that you have what you need. We advocate for you. And then these wonderful corporations that are in healthcare put up this big equal opportunity statements on their website saying that we are an equal opportunity employer. Come work for us. Come show the world you care. And then when you show up and you have a disability, whether that has high blood pressure, diabetes, a mother who is probably lactating, someone in a wheelchair, using a cane, some type of ambulatory issue, any type of mobility device, it becomes a stopping point. The gatekeepers say, you are an infection risk. I can't provide you the time to work here. I can't allow my staff to pick up what slack you may potentially bring to a unit. All of this conversation never encompasses the person with the disability or perceived disability. It never allows for the conversation to be had so that they can say, I can do it. Can you give me the shot? And that's all anyone ever wants, is the chance, whether you have a disability or not. That's all we're all clamoring for, is the chance to prove that we are worth something. And our worth should not be attached to a disability. So in healthcare, when we put out those words of bound, you are bound, bed bound, wheelchair bound, when you are putting in the words of just stagnant and oppressed, or wouldn't be able to do something, you can't walk, so your wheelchair just is not even seen. It's not considered as a mobility device. So you're hindered, you're limited. It's just, it layers the conversation for every other industry to take up. And when you look at it that way, you realize that it's really healthcare that causes the issue to begin with, because we're not pushing the fact that disability is active. We're not pushing the fact that you can still very much achieve. We're just saying baseline can't happen. Goodbye. Have a good life. Come to me, maybe if you're sick, and we can potentially help you. But right now during COVID, we're also shutting the door on that. We're also saying, we can't help you. Your quality of life is lower because of perception versus factuality. And for an evidence-based practice, I'm appalled by it. Every time I'm in the hospital setting, the nurses see me, they think that, oh, she wouldn't be able to run as fast to a code. Well, why do I need to run when I have 2 wheels? Like, my wheels are gonna get me there just as fast as your legs are, right? But you can correlate the two because representation isn't there. And because representation isn't there for me, I know my colleagues see how I work and they're automatically shifted. During the pandemic, and they saw me taking on 13 patients a night and not tiring out, and they're all running on their legs. And I'm like, I'm used to being up for 12 hours on my chair. You're not used to standing for 12 hours straight. There's a difference. See my strength, not my weakness.
And so I guess my other question to you was, are people seeing your strength more? And what impact are you having on the patients that you're serving?
So in terms of the patients, I think it's great to let them see that disability doesn't stop them, especially if they have had a stroke, if they've had some type of life-altering disability happen to them, whether they're now a spinal cord injury, whether they're CVA, which is a stroke, losing a part of a limb. When they see me roll into the room, it's a light bulb that's like, oh, life is going on. Life is going to continue to go on. It doesn't stop. They're seeing someone who's very active and moving. And then I've gotten the question of, how could I be their nurse when I look like I belong in the bed? And I was like, well, if I belong in the bed, let me take care of you first, and then tell me if you want the other nurse to come back.
That's great.
Right. It changes the way the narrative performs. And the narrative, again, is that disability is the death sentence. It's the hindrance to life. Yet we are all living proof that life continues to happen with disability or not.
Thank you very much.
And
Okay.
can I add something to that? And
Sure.
I would just really quick, because it just made me think about like the importance of how that representation matters. Seeing that, that is so important, for someone to see someone like Andrea be their nurse. Like, that is so important to, see someone who is on film or in TV, or who is an author, be able to write and tell their story, and to be able to showcase that representation is so important. I just had to, it really makes a difference.
I will totally jump in here too, because what Andrea and Tatiana said really struck me. And it makes me think of the fact that in second grade, there was a teacher in my elementary school who was a wheelchair user. She was paralyzed in a diving accident. And my parents strategically made sure that I was in her class so that I would be able to see, a role model, a teacher using a wheelchair. And that had a huge impact on me. And for years, I wanted to become a teacher. I thought all the way through college, that was what I was going to do. I changed gears and became an activist instead. But I think that seeing someone at such a young age who was doing something that I already wanted to do, I mean, my goodness, I was lining my stuffed animals to play school, from as young as I can remember. Being able to see that in real life and see that that was a possibility for me made a huge difference. So absolutely, representation matters.
So let me ask Erin and Anna, and then whoever else is behind the scenes, are there any questions that have come in yet that you could put in the chat? I will keep asking questions on our end.
I've also been watching as well, and it doesn't look like there are questions just yet, but we can put the opportunity out there for people to ask them, although we can just keep chatting while we're at it.
Okay, guys, please do me a favor, be brave. You don't have to put your name up. All questions are fine.
We don't bite.
Yeah, especially when you're not in front of us. So one question that we could ask all of you, first to you, Emily, what is the biggest takeaway you want people to have from this book?
Honestly, the biggest takeaway is that this shouldn't be the only book you read. And I'm very sincere about that. I am honored to have people read this book, but if the takeaway that you get from the book is that you are now done and you are a successful ally, then you probably missed the point of the book. So my hope is that people will read the book and will feel at least intrigued if they're not already in their learning process, or if they're just starting their learning process. They'll want to learn more. They'll want to read more. They'll want to watch more. They'll want to engage more with disabled people, and not from a place of pity or obligation, but from a place of authenticity. My hope is that people will understand that allyship is a process. It's not a title that you give to yourself. It's an ongoing journey, and it is something that you can mess up doing, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't keep trying. And I want people to keep going. I have always believed that one person cannot speak for an entire community. And so if you read one book and think that you've just learned about the entire community, that's not true. That shouldn't be your takeaway. Your takeaway should be, okay, who else can I go learn from now? Okay, who else has something to teach me? And I mean, already we have 2 more people on this conversation tonight, you know, Tatiana and Andrea, who are using their platforms to tell stories, to educate. Judy, you're using your platform to tell stories, to educate. Go seek out those stories. My goodness, there's 1.3 billion of us worldwide. There's more stories to be told. So keep going.
I would just like to say, I do think it's a good idea to read Emily's book. I do think it's a good idea to look at the back of Emily's book, where she lists all these other books that you can look at and consider reading. And I do think the point that there will be many other books coming out, and we can look at reading in many different ways. It doesn't just have to be in books. It can be in Instagram. It can be in any one of the social media platforms. So we have a question here, which says, it's from Marlene Brockington. Hey all, what is something you all know now that you wish you knew before you started your advocacy work? Tatiana, you want to go first? What do you wish you knew before you started your advocacy work?
Of how ableist the entertainment industry and all other sectors really were. I think I didn't fully understand until, you know, you dive into it. You think just people just aren't aware, but then you're like, oh, there's so much more work to be done. And I think just how much it is like a lifelong thing. And it's like, you've been doing this since the 70s and like, you're still going. So it's like, it's a lifelong thing. So I think I wish I would have known that. And hey, I might have still conquered it, but hey, I'm here. And yeah, and then also really, really spending time on discussing the intersectionality of disability and race, and thinking about it. For the longest time, I didn't think about you know, how that, you know, ableism compounded with racism and sexism all in affected my life and my experience and the experience of others like me. And so being aware of that, I think that was some things I wish that, you know, in my young age that I, you know, really thought about.
Thank you. So Andrea, how long have you had your disability?
So it's going to be 30 years next February.
And when did you start seeing yourself as being an advocate?
So from my initial diagnosis at 5 years old, when I used to tell my doctors that they couldn't take my blood at 6 o'clock in the morning because I was still sleeping. That was me advocating for myself as a 5-year-old. And my mom used to really enforce my voice as a child. So she built that up for me. She allowed me to say no and made sure that the adults around me respected my no. And she would then, allow me to say, okay, well, what about 10 minutes from now? Or what about, we implement other things, but she allowed me to be very strong in my conviction as a child. So when I was fully disabled at the age of 12, and I was transitioning to high school and being around, hormonal teenagers who love nothing more than to nitpick at people who are different than them. It was the same voice that I was given as a child, now just as a teenager, and saying, hold up, this is what I need. I'm not going to break what I need for anyone else around me. I'm not going to be silenced because you think it's what's right for me when I'm the one who has been living with what I've been living with. And then as an adult, when I became Miss Wheelchair New York and realized that the platform that I had, Life, Liberty, and the Pursuit of Access, it was going to be a platform that never left, like Tatiana said, right? It's something that's ongoing, lifelong, but also gave myself grace to take a break. I didn't need to always advocate for my own needs, and I can allow other advocates to kind of pick up the wheel and go with it and let them lead, because I don't always have to be stressed out because the world is inaccessible to me. We understand that it's inaccessible, but sometimes we put that weight on our shoulders and we don't know how to take it off for just a second. And it can be very wearing, especially in our community where we don't truly get to understand our identity as a disabled person, because it shifts so often with how society is moving. Sometimes it can be very hard to break away and kind of just find some grace in yourself. So I had to learn, that was the biggest lesson, was to say that I can take a break from being an advocate for the world and just be me and just live and not have to worry about what's accessible and what's not, what disability means and what it doesn't, and how other people want to interpret what I call myself or identify as.
Thank you so much. We have another question. This is from Elena Anderson and Gildia and Savannah Gildia. Sorry if I pronounced your name wrong. What is a good way to get your voice heard when you live in a smaller community? Who would like to go first?
I'd love to take this on because I think about this quite often, and people ask me about this quite often. They say that, oh, you have a platform and, people pay attention to what you say and nobody's going to listen to what I say because I don't have this many followers on Instagram or this many followers on Twitter or whatever the case may be. And I really like to remind people that you have to start somewhere. When I first began writing, I made a blog after I finished an internship program at the advice of my mentor in that program. And I started writing about my experience and about my thoughts on disability. And then I was excited because my mom and my grandma read it, right? And then one day I got a comment from a complete stranger who said that she had come across my blog and that what I had written had really resonated with her. And we started engaging in a conversation. And I realized that was exactly the impact I was hoping to have. One person found something that I wrote, and I was really just writing for myself at that point. And they said, hey, this resonates with me. And all it takes is making that connection with one person to start making that change. And so I really hope that people will recognize there is no such thing as too small, as not enough, as, we tend to judge people if they don't have some kind of large national platform. That's just not true at all. Everybody has a role to play in activism, in the movement. And something I've been thinking about, I tweeted about this the other night at like midnight. I was just laying awake thinking about this. You're always going to be either too radical, you're going to be not radical enough, you're going to be radical in the wrong way, you're going to be radical about the wrong things at the wrong time for the wrong reason. Somebody is always going to have something to say about your activism. But at the end of the day, if you are doing something that is not causing harm and is making an impact, even if it's an impact on one other person, you're making a difference, and you really shouldn't discount that.
Okay. Andrea, how would you answer that question? How do you have an impact in a smaller community?
I think that you have to tell your story for one. You have to have your own story out there, regardless if you're starting with a mass of people or with 2 people. 2 people can turn into 5, 5 turns into 10, 10 turns into 20, and so on and so forth. The point is to start talking, start saying what it is that's in your heart, in your mind, what's around you, speak about it. If you want to be in front of a large audience, you have to learn how to start at the smallest audience first. And the only way to understand and grow is to ensure that you can speak to that smaller audience and get that feedback. What do they need to know? Get those questions answered. Have it so that you're comfortable. Because when you get to the large platform, it's a whole different bag of worms. You are now dealing with the people who don't agree with what you're saying, who agree with what you're saying, who want to nitpick about how you look and how you represent the community, when even though you're not really representing the community, you're just trying to tell the story. And when you're trying to tell the story, it doesn't matter if you're telling it to 1 or 1,000, it's still a story to be told. And you have to remember that you have worth in that. You are worthy no matter how big or how small, like Emily said. Like, you have to hold on to that truth. So whether you're starting with 2 followers, I started with 150, and I think that was the majority of my high school and college friends. Now I'm at 30,000 people, and that's because I just continue to tell my story. I continue to push the envelope. I continue to ask the questions and find out what the questions were. Sometimes we don't know what the questions are to ask, but the people that we're talking to can give us those questions so that we can find the answers.
Thank you. How do you each feel about the word inspiration when it comes from a non-disabled person versus when it comes from a disabled person? Good question. And it's
Can I take this one first?
Sawyer.
So I think there's definitely a difference. I'll give you a scenario. Pre-pandemic, I was out grocery shopping because that was before I got my groceries delivered home. I would go to the grocery store and I would literally have people stop me and just say, "Oh my gosh, you're so inspiring." And I was like, "I'm grabbing milk. Like, how am I inspiring for grabbing milk? Like, I have to do my grocery shopping." Versus someone who has a disability, who has either read about me or follows my social media, there's a difference. They're inspired by me from what I do, whether it's my modeling, my acting, what I said. It's like they're inspired by the things about me that encourages them, based on, just like what we talked about, that representation matters. And so I feel when disabled people see it, it's representation for them. So they are inspired by the fact that, oh my gosh, I never thought about being a model. I've always wanted to do that. So maybe I should take a shot at it too. Versus someone is inspired by me because they just see that I'm just in a wheelchair and I just happen to come outside. And then I usually tell people, I was like, if you've read about me and Googled me, then go back and tell me how inspired you are by me. But you know nothing about me and what I've done. So don't be inspired by the fact that I'm just rolling through the grocery store. So I think there's definitely a difference.
I think maybe the word is motivated instead of inspiring, even when they're reading your story and learning more about you. It motivates them. I mean, they can use the word inspiring, but at the end of the day, I think it's really, you are helping to motivate people to think and do things that they likely hadn't either felt they could do, or they needed kind of another example of what someone like you was doing.
Yeah.
And Andrea.
Oh, yes, I agree. There is a complete difference between someone who is able-bodied telling me that I'm an inspiration versus someone from our community or someone within the disability realm telling me that I'm an inspiration. Usually when it's coming from our community, it's because of the fact that we, again, are like the first or the second, maybe the third. There's not much like us out there. So they see someone representing who they have the potential to become. And that is not in anything. So I can tell you firsthand, in nursing school, in medical model, anything, disability is not even written into the textbook. So a nurse or a doctor being presented with a patient with a disability, 9 times out of 10, the first time they're seeing a patient with a disability is in an ER on a clinical rotation or outside on the street, right? They're not seeing it on a consistent basis. So therefore, they don't even have the language to use for us. And then they use all the wrong language at that. And then, and that's on the able-bodied perspective, right? They don't have the language to be able to speak to someone with a disability because nothing that they even learn represents disability, although they treat it.
Mhm.
Go figure, right? And you can see that even in education, in the books that we read, in what's on TV, there's nothing that represents us. So therefore, when they see us in society, it's like, wait a minute, you're out, you're moving around. That comes down to the same political things that we are fighting every single day within the House laws for our mobility equipment and all of these other things that encompass our life. They know that. It's not that they know it off the top of their head. They know that the moment that they have an insurance issue and they call and pick up the phone and they get denied something and they're like, oh, okay, fine, whatever. We get denied something and we're there fighting tooth and nail to get it. They think of it as the hindrance. And again, it's perpetuated through everything that is out there that kind of provides this humanistic lifestyle that we all want to achieve. So when someone who has a disability says it, it's like, yes, please going, don't stop because I look up to you. I see me in you. Whereas the other side of it, it's like, I don't see you at all. And therefore I don't need to recognize you.
Thank you.
Can I add
Emily,
something about
Emily,
this? Yeah.
actually, Emily, I'm going to ask you the last question. We have about 3 minutes left.
Oh, okay.
So what would you like non-disabled people and what would you like disabled people to take away from your book? And
Oh,
don't talk about how you want them to read another book.
Well, I think my answer to the previous question is relevant to this one in the sense that I have so often noticed this inclination within the disability community that people feel like they're not doing enough. Like people feel like they could be doing more, and occupying a disabled body means that you need to constantly be putting yourselves out there, right? And so when people say, oh, I'm inspired by you, or I'm motivated because you wrote a book, or I look up to you, or whatever, I'm incredibly grateful. But I also really want people to understand that there are so many different ways to be an advocate. There are so many different ways that you can contribute. And I think that's always been my key takeaway. If you're a disabled person, you have a role to play. You can make a difference. If you're a non-disabled person, you also have a role to play, but I would really encourage you to know when it's your turn to pass the microphone, when you need to take a step back, when you need to listen, when you need to amplify what other people are saying. Remember that non-disabled people don't need to be centered in conversations about disability. And further, disabled people who come from a place of privilege also don't always need to be centered in conversations about disability. And so I think that both of those are my key takeaways. But my other key takeaway, and people might think this is a little paradoxical, is I don't want you to start overthinking disability either, because I think that there's this inclination that we have, especially if you're non-disabled. I don't know how to act around disabled people. I don't know what to say. I don't know what to think. I don't know what to do. And then if you read my book, you're going to be like, oh my God, there's so many rules. What if I make a mistake? Not true. Not true. At the end of the day, I'm trying to offer you guidance, but I understand that you're still a human being. If you say something that's ableist, I'm not going to love it, but I'm also not going to disown you. Like, we can work on that. So I want people to be mindful, but I also want people to recognize our humanity and keep it simple.
And this has been a great conversation. And I believe Erin and Anna, do you want to have the concluding remarks, or do you want me to do it?
Yes, hello. Thank you so
So
much.
guys,
Thank you so much, Judy. I'm very honored that Easter Seals and the Disability Readathon were able to host this wonderful panel discussion together on how to be a thoughtful and informed ally to the disability community. And we want to thank and congratulate Emily on her fantastic debut book, Demystifying Disability. And thank you to our esteemed panel discussion guests, Tatiana Lee, and our very own Easter Seals Ambassador, Andrea Delzell. And thank you to our interpreters from Pro Bono ASL.
And of course, many, many thanks and much love to Judy Heumann for moderating this incredible event. Your words and your entire body of work have changed the world and helped shape the next generation of human rights activists. So thank you so much. What an amazing panel from all of y'all. It was great to get to do opening and closing remarks. Thank you to everybody who tuned in for this. If you're just joining us now or would like to go back and rewatch, we are going to have the panel posted up on the Easter Seals YouTube page before too long. And if you'd like to learn more about the Disability Readathon, which Erin and I co-created, go to disabilityreadathon.com. And if you'd like to learn more about Easter Seals and the book clubs and the kind of work that those folks do, you can visit easterseals.com. So thank you so much again for joining us, and everybody have a great night.
and also you're going to have up all the information about the book,
Yes.
about Tatiana, about Andrea. Okay,
Yes.
and next we want to see many of you entering into the fray, responding and doing your own original work. And maybe next year you can be the book for the readathon. Thank you all. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.